So I'm Becky Ravenkamp. There's a couple of you I haven't met. So I'm the Bow Creek Watershed Coordinator. I work for the Lewis and Clark NRD, and hopefully we'll have a good interaction today. Hopefully it'll be worth your time to come, and hopefully you can interact with each other. And the biggest thing is, after you leave and you're thinking about these things, we always just ask that you get information from somebody with experience, because it's easy to just say it doesn't work or that'll never work here or whatever. But to really understand the principles and how to apply these things, talk to somebody that's got experience. And if you don't know somebody with experience, between the network of people that we've got, we can help you find somebody that is experienced with this stuff. Everything that can go wrong will go wrong. So for the project, the Bow Creek Watershed Project, we have a professional team that I go to for advice. And so the technical advisory team, we meet twice a month, and we appreciate the time that they spend to help advise us on the project. And also want to thank all the staff at the NRD that helps put all these things together. So just want to go over a little bit about the program and remind everybody that we do have some incentive programs. So the Bow Creek Watershed Project is a project of the Lewis and Clark NRD. We're located up here in Northeast Colorado for those that are watching this recording later. And one of the things that the NRDs are responsible for is non-point source pollution. And so on your evaluation that you guys have, you have a pre and a post evaluation that you picked up, and you can mark the 4 pollutants of Bow Creek. This just helps us to see if we're educating anybody with these events. So the 4 pollutants in Bow Creek are phosphorus, nitrogen, sediment, and E. coli bacteria. So in 2010, the Department of Environment and Energy did the first water quality testing in Bow Creek. And because of the impairments at that time, Bow Creek was added to the 303D list in the integrated report that they have to send into the EPA. They came back in 2016, did that testing again, still have elevated levels of E. coli. So in 2019, the NRD updated their water quality management plan, included a plan to address those impairments in Bow Creek. And in 2020, they were awarded funding from Department of Environment and Energy's 319 program and the Environmental Trust. So we have 4 stream segments that have recreational use designations that are impaired for E. coli. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that West Bow Creek, west of Fordyce, is any cleaner than it is east of Fordyce. It just means that it doesn't have a recreational use designation. So if it doesn't have a recreational use designation, it doesn't get impaired for E. coli, because they're really concerned about people coming into contact with that E. coli in the water when they're out there in the summer splashing around in the water, because it is a health hazard for people. First, it's an indicator of fecal matter in the water, which for me is just an ooh factor. And but really, it can be pretty serious for some people that are exposed to E. coli. So there was 1 death from E. coli in Nebraska in 2020. Thankfully, most of the time, it's pretty mild symptoms. Abdominal cramps, diarrhea, maybe some fatigue, nausea. Usually doesn't have a fever, but it can result in some pretty serious stuff. This HUS, which can lead to lifelong issues and even death. And in 1999, there were almost 800 people that got sick from drinking water at a fairground. 9% or 70 of those people were hospitalized, and 15 of them developed this serious side effect, and 2 of them actually died from that outbreak. So it can be pretty serious, but thankfully, we don't have any indication that any of the serious side effects have been traced back to Bow Creek. But here's the 2016 testing that was done by Department of Environment and Energy. They kind of have a sliding scale of what's safe and what's not. So anything less than 126 colony forming units would be considered tolerable. So if you came into contact with that, you'd probably be okay. So anything less than 126 is highlighted in green. And then they kind of have a sliding scale of how many people are recreating in that water, kind of impacts what they consider acceptable. So 576 would be the maximum that they would consider acceptable. And you can see anything over that is shaded in red. And so we've got a lot of our recreational points in Bow Creek would be over those acceptable levels in 2016. So then they continued to do it throughout the whole year. They were taking tests once a month. And you can see even in the winter months, when the water was cold, we have some E. coli issues. So we started doing some expanded testing in 2021. We did more points along the creek, even in sections that weren't recreational, because we kind of wanted to see what was happening out there. And you can see we've got some green. We're looking, okay towards the end of the season. But unfortunately, that's because we didn't have any rain. So we kind of thought, well, maybe this was the best case scenario because it was pretty dry in 21. But you can see we do have those white boxes in the middle there, 24,000. And it maxed out the test, so we don't even know how much was in there. So that was pretty high. But in that particular case, nobody would have been in that water because it stunk so bad. They would have went somewhere else that day. I don't know what was going on there, but yeah, it had something going on. So then we did the same testing in 2022. And as dry as it was in 21, we thought, well, 22 will be a different story. Well, it kind of was because it was even drier. But again, you can see week 5, we've got, we go from 125 to 14,000 there in Bow Creek, North Hawaiian. So we're kind of all over the place. We still have higher elevations. And then this was just a slide you can see, especially in 2022, that E. coli kind of follows that curve in the rainfall. And this 7.7 rainfall was not captured on the E. coli because we were doing it every other week. So we didn't actually test the week that we had that rain event. But you can kind of see that it does follow rainfall patterns. That tells us that it's because of the sediment either being carried in or churned up in the stream. So we're trying to get management practices on the ground that will help infiltrate water and reduce some of that runoff so that we're taking less sediment into the stream and feeding the stream through groundwater instead of runoff. So here are some of the priority management practices. And you can see the septic system upgrade. If we can repair septic systems that aren't functioning properly, we can eliminate the E. coli that's coming out of those. The other practices, 70%, 33% will help. And if we could get that across the whole watershed, then we could really make some good improvements here. So to encourage those practices, we have an incentive and education payment program. And how that works is if you have no-till cover crops, grass waterway practices, you would get a conservation contract through one of our partners, NRCS, whoever, to do that. And our incentive payment would bring you up to 75% cost share on that. So if that practice costs $20 an acre, your cost share payment would probably be somewhere in the $10 an acre range. Our payment would be $5 an acre to bring you to 75%. And then we would have a $7,500 maximum payment. However, if you do more than one of those practices together, we'll bump that up to 90%. So on that same practice, instead of your incentive payment being $5, it jumps to $8 to bring you up to 90%. And then we would pay an incentive payment on that second practice that would bring you up to 90%. And then some of them, we just jump right to 90%. So if you're doing nutrient management by itself, we'll just go right to 90% because we feel like that is a practice that'll really get us some good results. And then we have some that are just a flat rate. So if you've got some of the CRP payments or the crop rotation, we just do a flat payment on that. So if you were to max out your contract at $10,000 at the beginning of the contract, we give you half of it up front to get you started, and then you get the other half after you've done 6 clock hours of education. So if you're in the room today and you're in Bow Creek, make sure you sign up so we have record that you're here. If you're watching online or you're watching the recording, make sure you send us a note so that we can give you credit for the training today. If you guys have questions about the incentive program, talk with the NRCS office. I know they've got some spring programs available this year that you can still get in on. And, you know, they're knowledgeable about the Bow Creek program. So definitely go down to the office and talk to the NRCS or the FSA program if you're interested in that. So with that, I just want to remind everybody that because of the weather, we've had to reshuffle. So March 30th will be the next workshop. And we'll be talking about nitrogen cycling and how rotations impact that. And then talking about those nutrient management plans, how you can put one together for yourself and what's required if you're thinking about doing it with the NRCS. And just to remind you that we do have door prizes for anybody that completes their evaluation today. So with that, we will turn over and we will let Virginia get her.
My name is Virginia. I'm obviously not from around here. I grew up in North Carolina. And then I ended up just kind of moving all over the U.S. chasing jobs like we academics normally do. So I spent some time in Eastern Washington State, which is pretty dry. And then I spent some time out in the Mojave Desert. And then I spent some time down in Texas for a little while, where the Texans reminded me all the time that I had a drawl, but it wasn't a Texan drawl. And I would tell them, thank God. And then I came up to Lincoln after that. But the drawl has followed me everywhere. I can't seem to shake it. My parents are from Korea, though, so they have like very strong Korean accents. So it's really weird coming to our house where, yeah. Anyway, so I have a soil science background. I actually had originally been trained in forestry, but really when it comes to soil concepts and biology concepts, you know, we've done a pretty good job of nailing down what those concepts are, and they're pretty translatable from one system to the next, whether you're working in forests or rangelands or grasslands or croplands. So that's been a really nice way to look at the different ecosystems that we have, and then use soil biology as a framework for looking at how those different systems are working. So just want to acknowledge a bunch of other, these are the main folks that have worked with me on some of this work, but there are many, many others here too. So just to kind of back it all the way up to thinking about soils is, you know, when we think about soils, it's really been the groundwork for how all the civilizations, human civilizations, have come to be. So if we look at these artifacts from way back when, you know, thousands of years ago, they all have some mention of agriculture, whether it's animal agriculture or crops. But this all comes back to when we were not having to forage for foods as much anymore, and being able to sort of develop our civilizations. A lot of it just depended on, can we make food so we don't have to travel around to get it. But, you know, then they made a movie about this in 2015 with Matt Damon, right? And I don't know if y'all saw this movie. He was like trying to grow potatoes on Mars using, I don't know, poop or something like that. Yeah. But, you know, NASA actually had him beat. They had already taken food up to the International Space Station the year before. And for many, many years, NASA has always taken up biological samples into space to see how biology reacts to being not on Earth. So, you know, in the same way that soils were the foundation of our civilizations, they're also the reason why many of them failed. When soils degraded, you know, what ended up happening was that in a lot of ways, There was just kind of either a lack of knowledge about how these systems were working, or a lack of will, or whether that was political will or whatever else was going on at the time. And so what would happen is that these soils would essentially get stripped off the landscape, whether it was erosion or land clearing or something, or climate change also. And so we have these many, many civilizations in the past that lasted, I mean, some of these are thousands of years in age, and they collapsed. Like the most recent one being the Easter Island civilizations. So, you know, we can tie back a lot of these failures back to not being able to provide food. And a lot of times there's a lot of civil unrest going on too at the same time. So even way back then, the philosophers would write about how fertile the soils were up on the hillsides, but then because of, you know, military or other unrest reasons, they would be stripping the hillsides of the wood because they needed it for one reason or another. And then all the erosion would take the soil away. So, you know, 9,000 years of soils being washed away in a very short time and just leaving the land nothing but skin and bone. But we've had these failures in America too. It's not just overseas. And some of them, like the Dust Bowl comes up real frequently. And a lot of that was just a failure to understand that at that time, in that region of the United States, we were planting wheat in an area where they were having abundant rainfall at the time. And so the wheat did super well. But the climate patterns take so long that we had a very long period of good rainfall where everyone was planting wheat and doing well. And then the climate kind of returned to normal, which was super dry. And then that's when the Dust Bowl started. So, you know, we had these like these pictures from Hastings and from South Dakota. But really it was happening in the South too, where, let's see if I can use this thing. So like there's a dude right there standing at the bottom of the ravine, pointing at his property, his homestead up here. And all that's water erosion that has happened since settlement. Same here in Georgia. You know, this was all level at one point and water erosion took that away. Or even examples here, like in where I was at in Eastern Washington, where the wind has just eroded away that soil level. And it can be really severe. Once you lose soil, you know, it takes so long to build soil. Once you lose it, it's really, really hard. We're not going to see it again in our lifetimes. So lack of knowledge about the regional climate patterns and not really understanding how our management interacted with climate had a lot of impacts on leading to soil loss and soil degradation. And I'll say, like, I say the word soil, and I know you guys understand me that I'm saying soil. It's really hard to say soil. I actually had a lady ask me once if I could read her chakras and whatever, because she thought I said I was a soul scientist. I was like, no. She's like, y'all have science for that? Could you tell me what color my aura is? And no, soil, not soul. Although they're not that far apart, really. So, you know, when we see these soil failures going on, it actually triggered a lot of other imbalances in the ecosystem. And so we would see those impacts hitting livestock, where producers would just have to destroy because they just didn't have the feed to maintain them. But then we'd see these pests where, you know, we had these jackrabbit roundups going on in Kansas because they just went out of control. I think this Colorado Springs photo, the National Guard actually had to go out with flamethrowers to kind of get rid of that because they were just so abundant in the city center. So, you know, we really see how making sure that our soils are healthy and that we're managing them well also means that there's other components of our lives that and health that are being impacted by that. So, okay, you know, I talked about a bunch of failures. They're not just happening in the past, they're happening these days too. We still see them on a super windy day. I'm sure you see plenty of snark. There's a lot of, sediment that's on top of the snow. And then I think back last year in Box Butte County, where they were having all those fires and stuff, there was a lot of wind blowing the sediment around. I think I might have been on the road a day or two around this time, and I saw some of this right south of York, where the winds were blowing so hard across I-80 that it was blowing the semis over and stuff because there was so much sediment in the air. But we also know that if we manage the soils well and we're using conservation practices that, one, have a payment, and a lot of times, that we can kind of recover the use of a lot of these areas in ways that either do things like improve, like our retention. So here's an example where we've retained some corn stover here, and we've got a lot of snow catch going on, versus an area where we've harvested all the stover off. And then in the floods here that we had in 2019, where we were able to use some cereal rye there to kind of recover some areas that were adjacent to some floodlands that, that sand, none of that sand was there before. You fundamentally changed your soil property because all that flood water dumped this new material. So you might have had a clay loam there before, and now you don't. So some of those events can really result in some drastic changes, but you could still graze that. You can still do something with that land, even if it's not necessarily row crop anymore. So we've got better knowledge. We definitely have better technology. A lot of times the technology gets away from us. We got more technology than we know what to do with. But we have this knowledge about tillage and residue management using cover crops to try and control erosion issues, which a lot of that is leading to the E. coli problems and other nutrient pollution issues. But we can also use those same techniques to increase soil moisture storage. So you get less of that runoff and you get less carry off, and build that soil organic matter, which is so important for internal cycling of nutrients. So you could save some money and not have to apply so many agrochemicals. So I'm not familiar with what all your previous speakers have talked about, but a lot of times, folks talk about soil health, and they talk about the 3 pillars of soil health. It's always the biological, chemical, and physical components, and that's a traditional way of looking at it. But if you really look at all of those things, it really comes back to soil organic matter being in the center of all of those. And so if we look at the way soil organic matter is here in the center, and then that inner circle is what the impact is. The next circle is sort of the ecosystem property or the service that's being affected. And then the last outer circle are different kind of management strategies that we're using. I'm not going to read all those different components, but you can really see how all these different aspects of the soil, whether it's physical or chemical or biological, they really are affected by the way that we are actively managing the soils themselves. So really targeting soil organic matter is kind of farming for soil carbon or farming for soil biology. That's a really good way of looking at increasing the functionality of a lot of other components of your soil too. So what is it exactly? Well, soil biology is anything that's alive that's in your soil. So it could be plant roots, could be the animals that are in it. It's the insects that are there, earthworms and nematodes, and then just this whole universe of soil microbes, fungi, bacteria, cyanobacteria. There's just so many. And they all have a function there. So, includes all the living things that's involved in this carbon cycling. So the soil organic matter accrual, nutrient availability, a lot of particularly the soil microbial communities are involved with nitrogen cycling, how the nitrogen is available, phosphorus availability to your crops. We also have crop health. A lot of things that are going on in the soil end up affecting how your crops are growing. They trigger certain growth hormones. They trigger certain stress tolerance. There's also this thing now called molecular farming, which I was really interested to hear about, where a lot of the genetics and the crop breeders are actually looking at how do you use sort of external chemical signals to kind of signal to the crops to grow better, to be more disease resistant, or to do things. I mean, these are all signaling things that are coming from the soil. Of course, not all soil organisms are good. Some of them cause pests, some of them cause disease or pathologies. But at the same time, there are good microorganisms out there that prevent that from happening too. The soil biology impacts soil structure, which has an impact on your erosion control and water retention and environmental quality. So the pollutants that might go onto your soils, the soils take a really active part in breaking that stuff down. They're also involved in climate regulation and greenhouse gas production. Soils are also really biodiverse, and that biodiversity is a good thing for us to have. And finally, natural products, drug discovery. We get a lot of things out of the biology in that soil that we often don't really think about, because for the most part, people just look at dirt and it's just dirt. It's something that you build on. It's something that you stand on. It's something that's like, sometimes it's a problem, but we're not really thinking about soil as like a super organism, which I really think that's kind of what it is. So when we talk about soil management affecting soil biology and soil health, we have a number of different practices that we found over the years that tend to reduce soil health, and then there's others that tend to promote soil health. The things that tend to reduce soil health are things that cause a lot of disturbance in the soil. The soil is a living thing. The more you disturb it, the less well it's going to do. So if you have really aggressive tillage, if you've got lots of times where you're not feeding the soil and you got a lot of fallow, there's no energy there for the microorganisms or anything else. If you're giving it the same thing every day, monocropping, or every year, if you're using a lot of chemicals, if you're excessively removing your crop residue, a lot of, these are all sources of both food and protection for your soils. And doing any one of these things excessively is not a great thing. Of course, doing anything in excess, probably not a good thing. And then on the flip side, we have these managements that tend to promote soil health, things that, again, reduce disturbance or increase diversity. So going no-till or doing a reduced tillage practice, using cover crops, or having a more complex crop rotation, even incorporating perennials where you can, even if it's not in your row crops, your pivot corners, places, other parts of the landscape where it doesn't make sense to dump money in there with inputs because you're not going to get it back from yield, convert it to something else. Using other fertilizer types like manures or green manures, retaining crop residue, or at least an acceptable amount of crop residue, and then integrated pest management and some other weed control methods there. Okay, so what do we know works in Nebraska? So I titled this part sort of the win, lose, or draw thing. Some things work, some things, some things not really. So it's not really random. Like NRCS is really great at pushing this conservation practices, but they don't always work for everybody in the same way. And everybody's farm and everybody's ranch is different. And your timing of your operations are different. Your histories are different. And so some things that work on one farmer's enterprise may not work so well on another one. But the key is trying to dial that in so that can help. Well, one of the things that ARS has been doing for a long time is maintaining studies for the long term, because you can go out and do an on-farm trial Or you could set up a new study. But if it's brand new, how do you know if it's the management that's actually causing the difference that you're seeing, or if it's just because new? You disturbed it, you just started something new, how can you tell? So if you've got a long-term study, something that's been on the ground, managed the same way for many, many years, then you have a lot more confidence that the responses that you're seeing in the soil and your crops, that those are actually responses to the management. And now you can start teasing out all of the variation in weather from year to year. Good God, we have so much variation in weather. So these long-term studies are super helpful. So I'm just going to focus on this sort of southeast part of Nebraska here, where we've got more than these, but I'm just going to talk about these for now. We've got an integrated biomass study. This is really, I'm going to kind of focus here on corn stover removal. I noticed driving in, there's still bales out there on some people's lands and stuff like that. And we're seeing more and more stover removal happening for livestock purposes. But so we've got this long-term study here at South Central Ag Lab, was one of UNL's extension locations. And then we've got another one here just 10 miles east of Lincoln at Rogers Memorial Farm. And then the Eastern Nebraska Extension Center up here at Meade. And these are pretty old. So the one in Clay Center that was 12 years old, it's actually old. It's older now since we started in 2000. Oh, that should be 2010. Our cropping system study, that was started in 1980. And then we have a couple of other studies up here. We've got a marginal farmland study that was started in 98, and then a crop rotation study that we started in 72. So, I mean, these are long term. So, we have good data there that we feel pretty confident about. So this stover removal study originally started out as a project funded by the Department of Energy, because the Department of Energy looked at all the corn residue that was on the ground and they just considered it trash. They didn't think there was any value in it. And they thought, what if we scooped all that stuff off the ground and we turned it into ethanol? And that's why the Energy Department was interested in it. And then USDA came back and said, well, that stover is not all trash. It serves a lot of other purposes out there, and it's really not all available. And they don't have the chemistry tuned in to make ethanol out of stover anyhow. So what we had attempted to do sort of in the early 2000s to the mid 2010s was we had a bunch of field sites across the U.S. where we were taking no stover off, a moderate amount of stover off, and then just maximum, like whatever mechanically maximum we could take off. And we did this at 36 different field sites because we wanted to take a look at, what was the actual impact of removing that stover. And to some extent, as the genetics of corn has increased, we have so much more biomass out there. They can tolerate crowding a lot more. You've got a lot more, you've just got a lot more stuff. So to some extent, is there an amount of stover that we can actually take off and utilize? That would be another revenue stream for us, and still leave enough out on the in the field so that we're not compromising soil health and degrading the soil. So what we found was that if you're taking off anywhere between 1.7 to 3.2 tons of stover an acre, you're actually increasing your yield by about 5 bushels an acre on average across the U.S. And a lot of that was because of early spring warming. If you took the stover off, your soils warmed up a little earlier in the season. They dried up a little bit earlier in the season. And that early season advantage carried through to the end of the year. Now, that wasn't true at all places. That was true on average. We also decreased the amount of gas emissions coming from fertilizer use. And again, that was partially due to you take food off that the microbes would otherwise be using to have microbial activity, and you end up reducing some of their activity. But this was, for us, this was a good thing because nitrous oxide is a temperature forcing gas and is one of those that we've got our eye on. So then what about soil organic matter? On average, if you took off 2.5 tons an acre, if you left 2.5 tons of stover on your field per acre, your soil organic matter levels did not change. They didn't get bigger. Of course, we're always, aiming to try and build soil organic matter, but you didn't degrade it either. So that was kind of an interesting result to get back. Again, on average, some places were a lot higher, some places were a lot lower. So that's when we talk about stover removal. And, when folks talk about stover removal, they're like, all right, if you're going to take stover off, then you got to have some sort of companion practice that's going to mitigate the fact that you're taking this stover off and you're transporting it. You probably got a lot more machine traffic to to mow it, bale it, move it. If you're going to do all that to get the stover off, what other practices can you use to mitigate that removal practice? And the one that normally is recommended is, well, if you're going to take stover off, do your best to go no-till to reduce the amount of overall disturbance. And in this case, we had, again, these sort of long-term studies. We're also going to grab this study way out here in Fort Collins, Colorado. And we liked this because there was this gradient in rainfall, obviously, like Becky was saying earlier. But there's also a gradient in soil organic carbon content. So where you have it really dry, the soil organic carbon content tends to be low. So way out here, soil organic carbon is low. And as we move east, it gets higher just because there's more rain, there's more biomass, there's more carbon cycling happening. So in 2014, we kind of looked across these 3 irrigated sites, and they're all irrigated, and just took a look at what was going on to that soil organic carbon in that top foot of soil at those places. And what we found was, just like we expected, as you go from west to east, you get more carbon in that top foot of soil, just because that's the nature of the soils themselves, as well as the climate. And that those were significantly different. But what we also found when we look at long-term residue removal treatments at those sites was places where you retained stover had more carbon in it than when you remove stover. Yay, that was kind of like a no-duh thing, right? You would think that if you keep your stover on, you're going to have some carbon inputs going back to the soil. So was that entirely surprising to see? No, but this was also a no-till study. So if we thought that no-till was going to completely, counteract the effect of taking stover off, we would have expected those 2 bars to be exactly the same, right? No-till's going to make it better. Well, it didn't. At least not in this case. So how much did we actually lose? If we look at the difference between what we were stover retained and stover removed, we were losing about 1/4 ton of carbon a year. That's a lot in the top foot. Yes.
And that's soil organic carbon, not soil organic matter, right?
Yes. Soil organic carbon and soil organic matter, have y'all had this conversation on what the difference is, or what is the more meaningful metric for you all? I'm actually interested in that. Yes, sir. Jim.
Carbon, soil organic carbon, would that be considered humus?
It would be carbon is in humus, yes, but it is not equivalent to just humus. So it's kind of like thinking about nitrate versus nitrate nitrogen. So you can look at a chemical as the whole compound, nitrate versus just the nitrogen part of the compound. Or if you look at fertilizer, urea ammonium nitrate, right? You can look at the whole fertilizer, or you can look at it in terms of the pounds of N that you're applying. So in this case, soil organic matter is equivalent to fertilizer. It's equivalent to the whole compound. And then carbon is just that part of the soil organic matter that's made out of that carbon element. So in this case here, I'm not talking about soil organic matter. I'm talking about soil carbon. If you wanted to convert that to organic matter, I think you'd kind of multiply that by almost by 2. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So one of the big questions we get a lot from our producers is, how long does it take for the soil changes to occur? Whether you're adopting the conservation practice or you're moving away from the conservation practice, how long can I reasonably expect for benefits or any change to happen in the soil? Well, the answer, of course, is always going to be it depends. I don't know what your farm's going to do versus what other people. Here's what we saw at this site. And I will emphasize that all the studies that we maintain, these are all large plot studies. We use commercial scale equipment on all of them because we want them to be representative of what our producers are doing. So they're not like, we don't have grad students out there on their hands and knees weeding stuff and doing stuff that no one in their right mind is going to do on a big scale farm. These are using commercial practices. So at this Clay Center study, let's take a look at what happened with, either leaving stover on the field or taking, mechanically, we were bailing off as much as we could. We were mowing it to about 3 inches stubble height, and then we were windrowing it and round bailing it off. So we were taking off about as much as we could. So in this case, what we did was we thought, okay, can we ameliorate taking stover off, not just by using no-till, but what if we added a winter rye cover crop? Or what if we added livestock manure? But we only added that manure every other year, because if you add it every year, you get way too much pee. And that doesn't work very well. So we get phosphorus issues. So we're applying, animal manure every other year, about 12 to 13 fresh tons per acre. So what happens in that case, at least when it comes to yield, right? We want to know what the crops are going to do. Well, if you retain your stover versus removing, remember that earlier slide I showed saying, when you remove your stover, you actually get a yield bump, right? Because you got slightly earlier soil warming. So we saw that here at this study. But we also saw that the biggest benefit came from when we were adding poop. So if you have like livestock manure, and this was all cattle feedlot manure that we had stockpiled and then we're spreading with a manure spreader. I say we, but it wasn't me. It wasn't me. Our guys were doing. We actually had a 16 bushel increase when we took stover off. And this is over, over a 7-year period. So this is quite a long time. This is continuous corn too. So we don't have any rotations here. It's just continuous corn. So 16 bushel increase with stover removal is pretty remarkable. But a lot of that was driven by this really big jump here, or even bigger here when we added manure to those systems, because there's a lot of good stuff in manure. When we looked at nitrous oxide emissions, again, something that's impacting atmospheric gas concentrations, is that, again, when we take stover off and you take their food sources away, you get less biological activity. So you see a reduction in nitrous oxide emissions. We also saw a reduction in when we added manure, because what we ended up doing in those plots was we would credit that manure nitrogen out and not add the synthetic nitrogen there. So just taking that amount of synthetic nitrogen off really reduced the amount of nitrous oxide that was being emitted by the soils. And that happened really fast. That happened in that first year of management. But what about some of these other properties? You know, when we talk about soil health, a lot of folks talk about if water infiltration and water retention. Did any of these things change? Like what aggregate stability here is what we think about as being water erosion potential. If you've got aggregates of soil that are wet, if they stay together longer, they're less erodible. If they fall apart as soon as you hit them with water, that's just like saying that there's a lot of water erosion risk. And then soil organic carbon numbers. So in that top foot of soil, after the first 3 years of taking stover off, we didn't see any impact of stover removal on infiltration, retention, or available soil water. But we did immediately see a decrease in the stability of the soil. A lot more wheel traffic happening, right, when you're taking that stover off. And we did see a decrease in organic carbon, but that was really in the top inch. It was really shallow. 6 years later, and remember, continuous corn system, so we're taking the stover off every year, year after year after year. 6 years later, yep, we're seeing decreases in infiltration, saw a decrease in retention, decrease in available water, decrease in your water erosion risk was the stability was lower, and we were seeing decreases in organic carbon down to 8 inches. So this is almost like saying, you know, a little bit more than an inch a year, we're losing carbon, getting deeper and deeper. And what happened with cover crop? So if we use cover crops in 3 years, we didn't see anything. Why? Because cover crops are so tricky. They sometimes work great in some years, and other years they don't do crap because it doesn't rain enough. We can't get them in early enough. In a continuous corn system particularly, it was really hard to get the rye in early enough to give them enough time to establish before winter, and then make sure that we got them out before we planted. We've actually switched now where we're now green planting right into the rye in the spring, and we're planting a little bit earlier, like immediately after stover removal in the fall, to try and give another 4 or 5 weeks growing period to the rye. After 6 years, we still didn't see an impact of cover crops on any of these water infiltration, retention, or available water, but we did see an increase in soil organic carbon in the top 4 inches of soil. So it's not to say that using the cover crop wasn't helpful. It wasn't helpful for the things that we were looking at here, but we know that they were starting to have an impact on soil organic carbon. So different managements that you use, you can't expect the same timeline of management change to be happening if you're looking at, say, stover removal and then comparing that to cover crop use. You know, that they're working on different time scales. Yeah.
Right here. So I guess if we go back to so what we were just talking about with the stover removal and the cover crops. So just so I understand it, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So like we're looking at the 6 year, everything went down. But now so is the cover crop overlaid with that?
No, so yes. So this was looking at using cover crop on top of the stover removal. So so in this case, yes, if we look at using the cover crop, if you were having stover removal, the cover crop did counteract the stover removal. And thank you for pointing that out.
At least a remediator.
Yeah, it did. Yeah. Was it 100% remediation? No, there was still a slight reduction. Was it statistically significant? It wasn't. But, anytime you introduce another management operation and you just have more machine traffic and more disturbance going on your soil, that you're just going to, by default, you got to expect that there's going to be some level of degradation going on. So, can you use some other management practices to kind of ease off on how bad that impact's going to be? So thank you. So then we have the study up at Meade that is on what we call rain-fed marginal farmland. Marginal farmland, in our definition, is any farmland that was only 75% or less in the county average yield. So y'all may have some fields like that on your property. With the way that a lot of things went, recently we've seen a lot of folks pull what we would call marginal farmland out of CRP and put it back into corn. There's various drivers for why that might be the case. But there's also opportunity to do the reverse. If you've got a lot of marginal land and you're putting a lot of inputs on that land and you're not getting a lot of yield off of it, your profit margins there, if you're making a profit at all, are probably pretty small. And it may not be worth your time or labor to put that much input into your marginal areas. So if you went back to perennial, or if you did something else with that, or enrolled it back into CRP or something like that, you probably get better pay, get that land working for you for a little bit higher per acre income. So if we look at those marginal farmland areas, those tend to be a little bit less fertile when it comes to soil. But that means that the soils are they're more sensitive, right? If they're less fertile, they don't have the kind of buffer that our really rich soils have to really kind of do intensive management on them. If you do that same kind of intensive management on these marginal soils with lower organic carbon content, or maybe they're on more sloping areas, they're just a lot more sensitive to degradation. So if we had, so what we did here is we had 3 levels of fertilizer use. We had, again, no-till continuous corn. We had continuous switchgrass, which, is it's a native perennial, but whether we think of this as switchgrass or any other perennial pasture grass that you're using, it's a pretty good proxy. And then we had the system that we were calling rotational switchgrass. When people talk about perennial grasses, you think of the Great Plains and the tall grass prairie, and they're there forever. Well, when we're actually talking about switchgrass that's being bred for either biomass amount or forage digestibility, some things can change. And what we found was that one of the varieties of switchgrass that we planted, it went to hell after about 9 years. It just did not keep producing. So we ended up replacing it out. But really, if you think about how you might get in a CRP or some other planting contract, if it's about a 10-year period of time, you might want to be updating your what you're planting out there as far as grasses go every 10 years or so. So we put it in 2 years of soybeans and then put it back into an improved switchgrass variety. So what happened with soil organic carbon in those situations? So with corn, the more fertilizer you add, the bigger the corn gets, the more biomass you have, the more carbon gets in the soil. That makes a lot of sense. Now, if you have switchgrass going right next to it, oh crap, you've got switchgrass going right next to it, you do kind of see a little bit of an increase when you hit it with some fertilizer. It doesn't need anywhere near as much as corn does, but holy cow, we were getting like 4 to 5, 3 or 4 times more carbon, which kind of makes sense if you think about the grass itself. It's got a different root structure. And surprisingly, we saw the same with this rotational switchgrass. Even though it had not been continuous, like this grass had been there for nearly 20 years. And then this grass, we ended up pulling out after 9 years, had it 2 years in beans and then back into switchgrass. It did all right. And where we have that highlighted, those are actually significant increases in carbon over time. So, half a ton of carbon per acre per year in the top foot of soil, that's pretty good. That's pretty darn good. If we look long-term over those sites, a lot of folks are looking at sort of sustainability ideas. So if we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions and whether something is sustainable or not, when we look at no-till corn, you can see that most of these bars are above 0, right? If it's truly greenhouse gas neutral, it would be kind of equally distributed above and below that 0 line. But what we find is that there's just so much variability that these error bars pretty much still cover that 0 line. So even corn on marginal farmland still tended to be greenhouse gas neutral. And that was after 20 years.
And this is bigger than no-till continuous corn.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Which is about as intensive as you'd want to get on marginal land anyway. If we looked at continuous switchgrass, yeah, we got a lot of carbon storage going on there, and we tend to see that it's a sink or it's neutral. And why was it not completely like a greenhouse gas absorbing out of the atmosphere? It's because of this high nitrogen thing. Again, switchgrass, perennial grasses don't need the kind of nitrogen that corn needs. And on this marginal land, 120 pounds was way plenty for corn, way too much for grass. The grass couldn't utilize it all, and it ended up blowing off as nitrous oxide. So that was not a good, I mean, that was that's wasted money. That's what that is right there. We look at rotational switchgrass, and again, we see a lot of below ground storage going on. And it was, again, a sink or kind of neutral for this guy right here, where there wasn't a whole lot going on because it wasn't getting any help to grow. So, all right. So now we have this 40-year tillage and cropping system study it's in Eagle, just 10 miles east of Lincoln. And we know at this site, this was started in 1980, we were looking at 6 different tillage treatments. So they were going all the way from no-till to, oh man, the next slide has them all listed. And then we had some different crop rotations going on here. And then we had winter cover crops incorporated in some of these. And so little show and tell first. So some of this came out of, these came out of our sites actually. All right, can we guess, if we do this little slaking test, which of these soils came from grassland versus no-till versus disc till? Okay, we'll do the easy one first. Right? It's disked. The soils fall apart as soon as you hit it with water. That means there's a lot more erodibility happening there. So then we see these other two, and they're pretty clear. They've all been sitting in this water about the same amount of time, and one is no-till and one's grassland. So that's pretty good. Whichever one is no-till, that was pretty good for stabilizing that soil. So that no-till soil is right there, way on the right, and the grasslands there on the left. So in this case, this 40 years of tillage, annual tillage at this Rogers Farm site, we would have randomized these tillage treatments across a landscape. So we'd have a ridge till, a chisel till, a moldboard plow, no-till, a disc till, and a subsoil ripper. Did this for 30 years. The last 10 years, we actually stopped tilling because we wanted to see what happened when the soils would recover. So started in 1980, 6 tillage practices from no disturbance to very disturbed. And then we had 3 rotation systems: continuous corn, soybean. Both phases of that crop was present every year. And then we had continuous soybean. We don't do continuous soybean in this part of the country, but it's popular, like out in Ohio and Illinois, where you get further, where it's a lot more rain. So what happened to the soil organic carbon in the top foot in those systems? Well, we found out that it didn't really matter. There wasn't any interaction between what kind of tillage practice you used or what kind of crop rotation you used. The results were pretty independent. So when you go from a less disturbed system to a more disturbed system, your carbon decreases. Again, a no-duh result. But it is interesting to see exactly how much, right? And I don't know, have y'all been contacted by any of these like carbon crediting companies to see if you want to enroll in acreage, right? So some of these numbers are a big interest to them because they want to know, and your payment's going to be based on how much carbon you think you're going to be able to store in your soil within a 5-year, 10-year contract or whatever they have. And then if we looked at cropping system, we basically didn't see any differences between the cropping systems themselves, which was kind of surprising because we thought that the continuous soybean system would be the crappiest because it had the least biomass. But really over time, and this is a rain-fed system, if they're relatively well managed, your soils can, you know, they can maintain and they can do pretty well. One of the biggest assumptions that we have is that more plant diversity can improve soil carbon, whether it's plant diversity in your system if you're introducing a new cover crop or cover crop mix, or if you're just increasing the complexity of the different crops you're using in your crop rotation. How is, you know, whatever form that you're increasing the diversity, there's this expectation that when you increase the plant diversity, you improve soil organic carbon and improve other services that might be coming out of here. So there was actually this global analysis that was done. And what these authors found was that, yep, in about 70% of the cases, when you increase plant diversity in your system, however you choose to increase plant diversity in your system, you increase carbon storage. Yay, good. Did it increase your crop pollination? Well, for corn, you know, we don't use pollinators. Corn is wind pollinated. But for, you know, for other crops, you know, did having more plant diversity increase crop pollination? It was kind of neutral. This was the really big surprising one. A lot of people assumed that if you have more plant diversity, then you're going to get much better pest control in your cropping systems. Maybe you would have less insect damage and things like that. And what they found was that really it didn't have that big of an impact at all. It was pretty neutral. Here's our 50-year crop rotation study, also up at Mead. It's rain-fed. So it got started in 1972. It was disc-tilled for a long time, up until 2005, and then we went no-till after that. But at this study site, we had 7 different cropping systems. So we had continuous corn, continuous soybean, continuous sorghum, and then we have every 2-year, you know, sorghum, soybean, corn, soybean, those 2-year rotations. And then we had 2 4-year rotations, which was corn, sorghum, corn, soybean, sorghum, and oat clover. And that oat clover actually overwintered as a winter cover crop. And then we would just flip the other rotation. We just flipped the soybean and oat clover sequence. So it's the same crops, different sequence, right? So we were still putting between the corn and between the grain sorghum, we were still having a nitrogen fixer in there somehow. And then we had 3 different levels of nitrogen. So I'm pointing out these 2 plots here. And so what are some obvious differences between that plot and that plot? Height, color. And interestingly, both of these have the exact same nitrogen rate. The only difference between those 2 is what crop rotation we used. So these are 0N. So that's 0N corn. It looks like crap. And this is 0N corn, but with a 4-year rotation. So 0N, no N, since I think 1980. So what happened here in the top foot of soil when we look at soil organic carbon? Well, we didn't really see any differences in soil organic carbon between the monocrop soils, the continuous corn, continuous soybean, continuous sorghum, or between the 2-year rotations. They were really similar. But where we did see a bigger increase was where we were using the 4-year rotations. And we think this also has something to do with the fact that the 4-year rotations had more continuous root cover throughout the year because that clover was overwintering. And we would kill it off in the spring. So, all right. So which of these is 0N corn? Any guesses? Well, you would have been right if you'd picked that guy, but you also would have been right if you picked that guy, and you also would have been right if you picked that guy. These are all 0N corn, and the only difference here is that they came from different rotations. And again, this is continuous corn, and we see this year after year after year after year. This is no different. We're very confident that this is what we're seeing, and this is a for real management effect. 25 bushels an acre on average. When you have no fertilizer and continuous corn, you've got very little plant diversity there, very little diversity in the system. And then when we have this particular 4-year rotation, and this is really similar to just a corn soybean rotation too, you get that yield bump like we usually expect to have when you start rotating your crops. But, we have this really humongous bump when we have oats clover going in after corn. That was the one that has really shown the biggest benefit.
Before corn.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
Yeah.
Before corn. Yeah. So going from clover straight into corn that next year. And we would see this effect. Now, if I compared this to our, say, corn soybean that we added fertilizer to, those yields were closer to 190. I'm not going to lie to you. There's a benefit, of course, to adding fertilizer. But in this case, without adding any fertilizer, this is just purely crop rotation effect.
So just to be sure, so the grain sorghum was grown a normal season. The oats and clover was for a year, or just for because the sorghum was harvested in.
Yeah, then we would plant the oats and clover actually together
In the spring.
in the spring. Then we would harvest off the oats. The clover would stay behind. It'd end up overwintering.
Mhm.
And then we'd come back in the spring and kill it and then plant into
Just
that.
a common sweet clover.
It was a crimson and red clover mix.
It's all irrigated.
This is rain-fed, all rain-fed. Yeah. These would be kind of sorry yields if it was irrigated. I'd be kind of like embarrassed to show these if it was irrigated yield.
They get rain down there.
And then no-till?
Yep.
Okay.
No till since 2005. Now it was disc tilled up until that point, but pretty good long, at least
Do they ever track the grain sorghum yields?
we
That
do.
would be interesting.
Yep.
See.
We have all the yields.
Okay.
I'm just not showing them here. We actually have a Crop Watch article that reports the soybean yield, the grain sorghum yield, and the corn yield. We'll show all that. So,
I think I've seen this before, and it's just amazing the difference just in the order of rotation.
yeah, it wasn't even the diversity. The diversity is no difference. It was the sequence that made the difference. It was the sequence. So, that just goes to support, when producers ask us, will such and such practice work on my property? I don't know, because it depends, it's just like this, sequence matters, that your history matters, what you've done on your farm compared to your neighbor, that matters. And so again, it just takes time to dial in what the best practice is. And sometimes it's time that you don't have, but at least we can try and give you some indication, right, with these long-term studies. So if we go back to this win, lose, or draw idea, where draw is when we're just staying neutral, you're not losing carbon and you're not gaining it. But so what did we see? So you're definitely a loser if you're aggressively removing corn stover. If you add no-till, yeah, you make that a little bit less of a loss, but it's still a loss. If you add cover crops or if you add manure, you make that a little bit better. You're getting closer to something that's no impact. But then, under irrigation, you're already, these results that I showed, those were irrigated systems. They're already really intensely managed. What else is there left for you to possibly do? You could combine your cover crops and manure. Maybe you could add something else. Maybe you can, maybe you would use some other biological. I mean, there's your options start to get limited after a little while. You can only put so much capital into certain management practices before they don't start paying off for you. When we think about this in marginal farmlands, because you're already starting off with a pretty poor soil, they're more sensitive to change. But that also means that because they're really sensitive, if you use a conservation practice on those soils, they're also more responsive in a positive way. So you have a very sensitive soil to erosion or to other components. You put a conservation practice on it, they tend to respond positively faster than a less sensitive, more fertile soil. Again, it's that sort of that buffer effect that soil fertility kind of confers on that soil. If you have really aggressive tillage, you're a loser. So if you go from really aggressive to less aggressive, you start seeing maybe not way over on the win category, but certainly something that's more neutral. And again, these dynamics will change because if you have irrigation, that availability of water really speeds up the biology in your soil because you're giving them something that they really need. And then, when we look at cropping systems, if you go from continuous monocropping and you increase the rotation, particularly if you are adding a nitrogen fixer or some sort of legume to your cover crop, that there's some real benefits there. So I guess in closing, what does this mean for a carbon market? Some of y'all nodded your heads earlier that you've either been contacted by people about enrolling your farms for carbon markets. It is scary out there how quickly that whole carbon market thing has been taken off. There's zero regulation, y'all. Zero regulation in those markets. And yet we are hearing about millions of acres of farmland that are being contracted by people to look at soil carbon change that they are assuming is going to happen if you incorporate a practice. And if you have been very conscientious and used conservation practices in the past, you're SOL. If you have been doing it, that doesn't count. It has to be a new practice. It's got to be something new that you're doing. So you don't get any credit for being good stewards of your soils for many, many years. If you've had it, they only want to see you doing this new. Now they've built in safeguards so that you don't get some bad apples out there that say, oh, well, if that's the case, I'm going to till the crap out of this field and then I'm going to reset it to zero. And then I'm going to get, I'm going to get my carbon credits off of here. That there's things that prevent stuff like that from happening. But where are these carbon companies getting their expectations from? And how do you know that the numbers that they're expecting, that they are grabbing from big, studies or modeling or whatever, how do you know that that's actually going to apply to your farm? Because what happens at one point often is not the same as what's happening when you look at the average of what's going on everywhere. So what have we learned at these long-term studies? That what we see with long-term management, it depends on your initial soil status, right? Are you working off of a marginal farmland? Are you in some really fertile farmland? And time really makes a difference. How are you combining your practices? And what is the sequence of those practices? We've seen that also has an effect. And again, as carbon markets get more attention, I think it's really cool that people want to put a dollar value on how we manage soils and do good things like build soil organic matter. But I'm also really I'm cautious about it because these are also legal contracts. And unless you're getting your lawyer to take a really close look at these contracts to make sure that you're well protected, you don't want to be paying them for something that, yep, you in good faith adopted a practice. It did not go the way that you thought it was going to go. And that penalty is something that I don't think is really well defined. So, in the end, it would be really cool if we look at soil health, particularly soil organic carbon and soil organic matter gains, as another commodity, right? That'd be fundamentally different how we're looking at carbon right now in the soil. We look at it for fertility, yay, soil health, that's all feel, kind of warm, fuzzy, feel good. But if carbon actually becomes a commodity, a saleable commodity that you guys can actually start having a revenue stream from, potentially, that kind of changes the way that we really look at management and what we're doing on those landscapes. So there it is. The I guess it was bigger than soil biology, but soil biology is a real central part to the soil health component. So lots and lots of folks helped with all those studies, and appreciate y'all's attention.
Years now, we've got Jim Williams. We met Jim at our bus tour in August, and he was pretty quiet. I think he was trying to decide what kind of crazy we were on the bus before he shared any information with us. So he started talking about what he was doing on his farm, and we were almost to the first stop to get off the bus, and Jeff leans over and he goes, "Becky, tell the bus driver to slow down so we can listen to Jim longer." And I said, "No, we're already 4 hours late. You can go visit him." And so that's how we met Jim, and he's just going to kind of share what he's doing with his biologicals on his farm and the outcomes he's getting. And he's got some pictures to show you.
Ready? Anyway, my name's Jim Williams. And thanks, Becky, for inviting me. I might do some reading because this is the first time I've spoke since 10th grade. And it's my first PowerPoint. My wife helped me, but she made me do all the work because she's a teacher, and that's her teaching strategy. So you'll have to put up with it. But I'm honored to be able to pass on my lifetime findings from working in the soil. And I was lucky enough to get on the bus trip to meet these guys. So that's how I ended up here. But we operate 1,600 acres in Herrick, South Dakota. I have about 600 crop ground, 950 rotationally grazed. 28 years I ran yearling steers, moving them. And there's about 50 acres, trees, waste, farmsteads. My rotation is corn, beans, wheat. That's probably been since about 2008, so I've been through it a few times. Sometimes when people ask me where I live, I tell them 3 feet from the desert. We got about 2 to 3, some places 4 feet of silt loam soil. And then 50 foot of gravel, sand, and then there's water, but that's still in gravel. But our CEC's 12 to 22 organic matter has always been 1.4. I had one field that was 2.8, sometimes 2.6, sometimes 3 in there. It was my best field. I called the average of 2.2. My pHs were 5.3 to 6. Always low calcium, high hydrogen. My soil tests. Doug, that clipboard, can you bring that over? Just the clipboard. Yeah, thank you. And we live 10 miles north of Napier. So this picture was corn in August, early August 2020. That was about a month into our 2.5 year drought. You can see the brome in the ditch is a little yellow, but anyway, I want to tell you a little bit about my life, how I got to where I'm at. So that's it for the notes. Everything else, I'm just winging it. I got some closing statements, but I guess I can read it here. I grew up in Bellevue, Nebraska, in town. My dad was a carpenter. But my neighbor, Rudy, he had the lot between our house and theirs was all garden. And my mom said she couldn't keep me out of the garden before I could walk. So I kind of grew up a gardener. I followed Rudy around till after high school. But in about 6th grade, he got me started reading organic gardening and farming magazines. And so I built my first compost pile when I was in 7th grade. My mom went to school for a parent teachers conference, and she came home. I had a compost pile built. That was in August. And it was leaves, grass clippings, garden waste. But it worked. So I composted, and this book came out in it came out in 74. Complete book of composting. I'll just pass it around. I read that when I was a senior in high school.
Did you have a microscope?
Say that
Did you have
again?
a microscope then right away? When you started?
Actually, I had one, but I didn't know what to do with it. I'd won one on a contest when I was in grade school. No, I didn't have a microscope. I wouldn't have known what to do with it. I didn't know there was microorganisms yet. Okay, so anyway, but I worked as a carpenter. Well, I worked farm labor when I was in junior high school. I worked for a guy down where the Platte River runs into the Missouri on the bottom ground. So there was some heavy ground, there was some sand. So it was a mixture. Anyway, but then I worked as a carpenter after I graduated, like my dad. But work got a little slow there when interest rate was 20% and 18%. So my cousin was working on a ranch out in Sand Hills, so I went out and spent a week, stayed a year and a half. So, but anyway, I did their farming for them, labor, and run water drive pivots and wore out. Anyway, when I was there, I learned a lot about grass management when I was there because they were pretty good into that. And they had some boys in high school that were into that. And so I learned a lot about grass management, which I wouldn't have never thought of unless you go out into a fragile area. So, but while I was there, I wanted to put a garden in. So he says, well, you can just use this spot over here. That's where my mom always had a garden. So everything's blow sand. And here's this soil in this garden that was the nicest, richest, I mean, the greatest garden soil you could ever imagine. And I said, how did that get like that? And he said, my mom, she put a lot of manure and she mulched. She spent a lot of work making that. So it's possible. But these are life-changing moments. I didn't want to spend a long time on them, but they're important. Okay. Anyway, I got married, and a couple of years after, my wife took the kids to the library, and I rode along, and I found, it wasn't this book, but it was this book, and that was a big life-changing. I learned about diversity and roots and microorganisms. And that's a book that was wrote in the 40s. And, if I read it today, I wouldn't think the same because it talks a lot about deep tillage. And I have no need for deep tillage anymore. You'll find out later. So anyway, I practiced that on our home garden and lawn. And we went through a drought one year, and our grass was green and everybody else was brown. So it worked. Okay. Anyway, we were looking for an acreage, and I told my wife while we were looking that what I really wanted to do was farm, because I couldn't see buying an acreage 40 miles out of Omaha, driving back and forth every day. I didn't want to do that. So she said, well, we should go look for a farm. So, and I did look in Bloomfield. We looked at one, and one in Niobrara. We ended up in South Dakota. And I got to thank my wife and kids and my best friend for making it possible. So, first thing I did when we got up there was cross fence, which I learned in the Sandhills, and started adding water. I didn't add waters the first year, but I think the second or third. And so we rotated cattle for a long time. But I tried some cover crops right away because I had been doing some cover crops and green manure crops in the garden, and so it just wasn't going to work because I didn't have the equipment, and I just had I 2 years and I gave it up. So I went to tillage, and I was trying not to use chemicals too much, but with the tillage, and I pretty well accomplished it, but we had about 7 years of drought in there. It kept getting a little drier every year, and next thing you know, you combine 5 bushel beans, and I knew it wasn't right. So neighbor was starting to no-till a little, so I switched to no-till and bought a good drill, 750 John Deere, and I bought a new sprayer, and then things were looking better. So and then now I had the drill, so I went back to cover crops in 2008, and so then I kind of got into I'd done soil testing before, but I kind of got more into soil testing, and I wanted to fix the base saturation and build organic matter. I wanted to fix the soil, and so I was testing every field every year and spending a lot of money on fertilizer. I know one year I put 2 tons of lime out because I thought I had to, and go back the next fall, and my levels were lower. My calcium was like a point or two lower, and where I put it, and pH was like never changed, and it's like, well, so I only did that once, and then I learned on that. So so one year I thought, well, I just wonder what it's like, and as I pulled a sample of native grass. Whoop. I wanted to just see what it was or supposed to be. Now, it wasn't like I'm going to say it was native grass, but it probably been abused 80 years before I got there, maybe 85. So it was because the pastures had been grubbed to nothing always. The guy's motto was, if they don't eat it, it goes to waste. So, and his dad, he probably learned that from his dad. But anyway, the base saturation was sitting there. I liked it. It's like, boy, yeah, I know I can do it now. So now I know I could do it. So then I tried a little harder, gonna make it right. Well, anyway, I woke up one morning and it must have come to me overnight that you can't do it. So with commercial fertilizer. So the next year I pulled a sample in the garden, and it's in here too. And soil organic matter 4.8, and pH was 7.5, and I had pHs in the 5s, everything else, So things can be different. These are both places that had never had anything done. So anyway, the next year I did I'd been buying starter fertilizer on my planter, so I had a test plot for Pioneer. And when I got done with the test plot, I had enough corn to make another round, so I made another round with the starter turned off. And I didn't tell the guy, but I just said it was a Pioneer number. So we tested it, and it made 3 bushel less. And so then I told him what I did. And he said, "Well, see, it's good." And I said, "Yeah, but I paid $20 an acre for what I put in there, and corn was $3, so that's $9. So it cost me $11. So I wasn't going to do that again." And then this next test I'm going to tell you came a couple years later, but I just threw it in here. This is after I started extracting, but I was still fertilizing, trying to correct things. And the last field they fertilized, they broke their rig down, and they wanted to know if they could bring a wagon up if I'd finish and whatever. So they'd set me up, and he said, "No, I went right to that one REA pole." Okay. And so I thought, well, I'll just start on the other side and work out in case I run out. Well, I did run out. There was a whole round there I didn't make. And then I remember going back after lunch, started combining, and I made a round. It was that year the corn was running about 130, 135 in there. Made a round, and it was yield gauge, yield monitor was there, and I started going, and it went up to like 145, and I didn't think nothing of it. And then when I was coming back, I saw that REA pole that he pointed at, and I knew what it was. And then when I got to where I was fertilizing, it dropped back down to 135. So, but then you got to understand, I've been cover crops heavily for quite a few years already.
Jim, was this before you were doing anything with extract?
That was after I started. So that field had gotten sprayed in my program. The field had been sprayed, but I was still fertilizing. I was adding it to the system.
Just explain a little bit then what you were spraying on.
I will in a little bit.
Okay, sure.
But that's when I figured out that I was adding it to the system. That's when I figured out that it was the system. Anything else we do is an addition. If we're adding fertilizer or we're adding chemicals of any kind, that's an addition to the system. So anyway, next. But I decided I couldn't figure that out. I tried. That's all. So I knew things weren't right. So the next year, my wife and I brainstormed and come up with a starter fertilizer. And I don't use it today, but it was calf milk replacer, sugar, and AMS, and seed soak. I soaked seed for the nutrients. And anyway, it was just a homemade mix. We figured, well, just put stuff that won't kill something and see what happens. Well, I did my own test that year, and I shut this thing off, and it made 3 bushel less where I shut the thing off. This cost about $1.60 $1.67, I think I figured that year. It'd be a little higher today, but so that was just kind of just things I was playing with. Also that year, now I already knew about biology. I didn't know much about it, but I knew it was there. So I got some good soil and soaked it in my water that I sprayed my beans, and they just turned dark green, just beautiful. And all I did was dug some good soil with biology in it and soaked it in my water, and put my Roundup in and sprayed the beans, and they just turned dark green. So you know something's there. So that winter, in January, I did some searching on the internet, and I found Dr. Elaine Ingham, and also then after that, I watched some of her videos, and she was going to be in Sioux Falls the next week. I happened to find out, so I thought, well, I won't get into that. But anyway, I called and I got in, and there was only 19 of us that spent 3 days with her at Sioux Falls. So learned a lot. That was like a life-changing event for me. But another person that I really like to listen to is Joel Williams. He's just real down to earth, and I don't know if it's the name, but he thinks a lot like I do. And then now since I finally started talking about it a little, I got a good friend in Chamberlain, South Dakota, named Jim Risto, that him and I share notes. So trade notes and ideas. So anyway, after that class, I knew it was right. And then I started doing total nutrient tests and bought a microscope. And that microscope, you don't just know how to use them. Takes a little bit, but I got cranked up on doing this myself, and then I took her course. I've been through her course and the microscope part, but not the consulting. I'm just consulting myself. So, but that microscope class, that's where you really learn the microorganisms, because you have to, you're forced to. So anyway, so I was back to composting, and I don't think I made more than one compost when we first moved there, and then I kind of started farming like everybody else. I think oops, and now I'm afraid to touch anything. Anyway, so the first thing you need to look at when you're composting is your water. City water has chlorine in it, and that kills biology. I'm going to say my whole life as a kid, I always used city water, and it worked. But I don't know what the biology looked like because I didn't know. But Elaine stresses it. You can let it sit out. You can aerate it. You can put humic acid in it to try to change that. There's probably other ways. But anyway, I had to come up with a method to compost, kind of big scale, but not too big. And you'll see that in a minute. Diversity is the key. We're going to talk about in a minute. I like to use local ingredients, like 100%, but pretty much local. Local earthworms, microorganisms, and all your ingredients that go in it. And the reason I stay aerobic, because if there's bad organisms in your soil, they're anaerobic. So I just strive to keep everything aerobic constantly in all processes, compost making, and when I make my mix, it goes right to the field while it's oxygenated and go spray. So this is just a list of ingredients that a lot of things I use. I'm not going to really go over them, but I kind of started out with browns. I'll talk to you about that in a minute, but it's just a list of things I use. But the main purpose of the compost for us is to increase the fungi in the soils because and the predators, but the biology's in our soils. It's taken over our soils, and or the bacteria, I'm sorry, has taken over our soils, and we just need to fix them and get a system that works.
How do you make the wood chips?
Say that again.
How do you make the wood chips?
Well, that was the easy part. I bought a wood chipper, the PTO. That's a lot of work. That was my first pile. I had a nice pile, but and I used them last June. I'd never used wood chips until last June's pile was the first one
I know a
used.
guy that uses an old silage cutter.
But so in Burke, the city, they have a tree dump, and they had a tornado come by through maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and they shredded a bunch of stuff. They had a pile of wood chips. I saw that.
I see.
I asked him if, oh, he says it's free. I says, well, if I bring my truck, will you load me? Yeah, he said they told him to get rid of it. So I hauled about 4 loads, I think, home, and I don't think I'll have to do any more. But I'm going to try re-chipping some of them and inoculating some piles that way. So yeah, it's a lot of work to do your own wood chips. So, but for biology, where it says soil, for biology, I get it all at home. And when I took my microscope part of the Elaine Ingham class, I spent days searching our place for where the good fungi is. That was my goal. If I didn't get anything out of that class other than that, I know where to go. And it's not always where you think.
You know where the fun guys are, huh?
Yes, I do. So that's it. Let's see.
Where did you think that they were going to be? What was surprising?
Well, no, I thought it would be in the old tree rows, but it was different places in the old tree rows than I thought. I guess that's kind of, and then there was places where you think it should have been, it wasn't. Surprisingly, the native pastures, like you like the nice blue stem, and I couldn't find much fungi in under their roots, which I think I should have, but I'm just saying I wasn't. But you want it in your compost, and go out if you're getting like native grasses, dig the whole plant up and the root ball, because there's biology in the plant, and it's all nitrogen fixing bacteria in those plants because they produce their own stuff. They're not waiting for you to come out there and feed them. So use the native plants. That's and then underneath dead logs that are rotten, get some dirt from underneath them. That's kind of a favorite places. But I have lots of favorite places. I got a favorite old pear tree and an old the old homesteads, like there's old lilac bushes or something. I always take a little from there. You know, even if they're not ideal, they're ideal because of diversity.
So were you checking them with a microscope before you put them in your compost to make sure?
Not today, but I did.
Apparently
Yes.
you were. When
Yeah,
you
yeah,
put them
yeah. I said I went through a microscope class. I
Yeah.
would just searched. Yeah, that was my thing. So when you make a pile, Elaine's recipe is 60% brown, 30% green, 10% high nitrogen. So that's a tough one for, not necessarily for a farmer, but for a lot of people to distinguish high end from greens. But I look at the protein levels, like if make a compost like you're feeding cattle, you know, just come up with a recipe that works. But look at the protein level. Soybean meal and blood meal, those are like the two queens for high end. But look at the protein level, not a chemical analysis, because I've seen a chemical analysis for blood meal that said 15 pounds of nitrogen. Well, that doesn't sound that great, but it's probably like 49% protein. So I go by the protein level. I used to always use Stockman's Handbook, but the internet now has all kinds of stuff on it. So, but that's how greens are green. I think we're going to get into that more. So, but if in doubt, go a little higher on the nitrogen part, because that assures that you didn't mess up on. It'd be better, you don't want something you don't want to build something that's not going to work, and then you're going to get discouraged. So you just might have to turn it a little sooner. That's all. So I encourage people to go stronger on nitrogen for starting out. And you just check the temperature every morning, as I do, and it can be 131 degrees or more for 3 days, 150 for 2 days, 165. You better turn it the next day. So, and then as far as the moisture, you want to check that every day during the heat phase, and continue after that, because it's like livestock. You don't want to let it run out of water. There was something else I was going to say about moisture, but
How do you check moisture?
just reach your hand in there and grab it.
Make sure.
Yeah. Oh, like once you make a pile and it starts to heat, don't add water. You'll cool it right down. If you turn your soaker hose back on, you'll cool it back down. Just let it finish its heat phase, and then turn. Then I like to wet it, then turn it, and then wet it, so that way if it's dry, you can. That's just my process. So I make my piles 50 foot long, and I've tried different lengths. That's what I stick with. 50 foot long. I use a 50-foot soaker hose on top. And sometimes I'll put 2 on top, but that works. I just layer it like a lasagna. I don't grind anything. I unroll bales and take my grapple fork and pile them up and do it in layers. And to figure my proportions for I take all the hay and grass or straw or whatever back to what dry matter would be, because that's the easiest way to figure it. Because my favorite thing is fresh greens, and I might have a bale that weighs 2,500 pounds. Well, I know if I let it dry and I baled it, it'd weigh 1,100. So I go by dry weight, because that gets your proportions right. always, so you're heavier on the brown. So I always start with the brown and end with the brown, and that helps you try to get close to where you should be. I always start with straw on the bottom because that lets air get underneath it for the beginning. I always go the same direction during heat phase. I might turn it 4 times, sometimes 5, but going the same direction, it assures eventually it all gets heated. And I check the same time every morning. Dogs love to go out and check compost. So, and June is my ultimate best time to make a compost. And as soon as you're done planting corn, start thinking about making a compost. Because that's when you got access to the true greens, because the road ditches are nice and green and around the buildings, and it's not headed, because once it starts to head, it's not a green anymore, it's going toward a brown. So you want lush grass or alfalfa or whatever. And alfalfa is a tough one because if you can't just say alfalfa's high end, because it'd take some really good alfalfa to be high end. Otherwise, alfalfa is mostly a green. And you know what good alfalfa is. So that's why June's my favorite time. You get the really good green grass, and you can hay that and save it for a later date, but it's when it's alive and it's got all the live microorganisms right on it, ready to go to work, and that's worth a lot. Then in late August, I always seed oats on the pile and cover it with straw, and I try to keep it pretty good and wet when it's going into winter. I don't like it to go into winter dry, like super dry. Ah, dang it, there's that wrong button again. I get it this
I
time.
think if you just click on your,
There you go. Whoop, that did
I
it.
think this is slideshow again. Get back into full. If that pops up again, I think you just have to.
Okay. And it's this button here, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And this is just some examples of, that's just me starting a pile. This was halfway through. I like to build them halfway and soak them a little bit. Maybe not fully soaked, but I like to wet them. So I might spend the morning gathering up stuff I want to use. After lunch, I'll build the pile and let that soaker hose run till I go to bed and shut it off and finish it the next day. But that's the manure and wood chips and mixed together. I just mix some stuff together now. I used to do a lot more handwork. Now I'll take my manure pile and put my wood chips on there, and I dump my soybean meal. I dump it, and then mix all that up. And then I just add a little bit of that every layer. Mostly put that stuff on your browns because your browns need help. Your greens don't. So almost push the wrong button. That's the same pile. This was, don't know when, second or third turn. This was when it was finished. And it's not really 100% decomposed. It's not really compost yet, but it's been through the heat phase. So that's when I'm seeding it with oats. And then I covered it with straw, and it just sits till next spring. And it'd be a different deal in the spring when you see it. It'll be full of worms. That's why you want your pile on the ground.
So you're just getting natural worms
Oh, yeah.
coming in from the
That's
bottom.
you have to have your pile on the ground.
Yeah.
You get more than just worms. That's just me turning a pile. That was the first turn. I don't know if it was that pile, but that's just showing how I do it. What I do is I take the top off the pile, I set it on the back side, and then I come into it and flip it. And that's it. Takes me 10 minutes to turn the pile and throw the soaker hose back on, and 4 or 5 times. No buckets or pitchforks.
You saw a pitchfork earlier.
I was going to bring one, but no. This isn't the pile we were looking at building earlier. This is my old pile, seated down, oats coming up.
So Jim, on your compost piles, you're trying to, usually the center is probably the warmest spots, so you're trying to take the center of the pile and get it on, when you're turning your piles to get the outside into the center, and then your center's onto the top.
I know Elaine has a system, but mine's different. But as long as you're consistent what you do and you can get through the whole pile, you're going to be fine. You know, I don't want to take anything and set it aside because that's too much work. And I just take the top off and set it on the back side and then roll this over it. So the middle kind of is smeared over, like the hot middle is on top now, kind of.
Okay. Yeah.
It's just what I came up with. It was so easy and it works. And there's anyway, that's those same oats we just saw seeded right before winter there. How they come up. Now I'll reseed them in the spring. And I would like to experiment with some different things sometime, but I just like oats, and oats are, I inoculate your seed with mycorrhizal fungi when you seed it, and hopefully you can get some in your pile, because mycorrhizal fungi can't go through the heat phase. So that's the purpose of the oats, other than winter cover and the exudates. So it's just good. This is that pile we were building earlier this winter. And that first shovel I went into the compost last spring, there was just worms just hanging in there. One shovel full, and they were just hanging. And of course, I'm a little slow. By the time I got my phone, they were kind of retracting back, but I took a picture, and it just kind of goes with my daughter, because this is my daughter. I went last fall and helped her build a hand pile with pitchfork. But she's interested. She's been building compost piles for quite a few years now, and but smaller ones, and so I just went over and helped her out. And but she also raises worms, so she's got a worm farm, and so that's why I put her next to the worms. So, and she was always sending me samples of her castings to look under the microscope, and I kept telling her that, well, it's kind of started out okay, and then it kept seeing anaerobic things, and then it kept getting worse, and so I was trying to get her to feed them a little different, and then I just said, well, you just got to get them out of that plastic tote. So she took them out of the plastic tote, put them in a canvas breathable thing for worms. And that next sample she sent me, you wouldn't believe it. That was like the best thing I'd ever looked at in my life. So that's why I don't like totes. So I like compost on the ground. Oh, I almost messed up again. Okay, now what? So you got the compost made, and sorry I couldn't bring you any. It was kind of frozen. It's like that pile yet. But I coarse screen it. My first attempt in my blower, I thought, well, I don't even need to screen it. Well, there was a big old flat rock that was in there, and it got down to the bottom and plugged up my cone tank. So I learned to coarse screen. And then I prepare a diluted food source, and that's food source for the microorganisms that I'm going to put out. I fill the extractor with water and turn it on. I'll show you that in a little bit. I kind of go by about a pound and a half of compost per acre that I spray. I run everything through a filter screen. I call it a filter tank that I made that everything goes through that's going to go into my sprayer or planter. Has eliminated all my problems. It's just one little bit finer screen than what I have in my planter and sprayer. And then you want to spray it immediately because that's when everything's alive. You know, once you add the foods, you add the foods when you go into the tank. Once you add the foods, things can start growing and it might not be good, but I've never found out. So, and I use large nozzles and low pressure, high volume. And then in my planter and sprayer, I use a 30 screen. When I first started, I had 50s and I had screens in every nozzle, and it just took a while to figure it all out. That's my sprayer. It's just a 60-foot booms, 1,000-gallon tank. It's great, except I don't like the tank because it's too hard to clean. You need a smooth sides in there, something without the ribs and baffles. That's my planter setup. I filled two of the totes with compost extract, and this is my food source and my seed. So it just works great because I just pull the planter up. I can fill it up in a short time and on my way. When I started, I was going back to home every time I wanted to fill. It wasn't working. That's my setup that I just kind of came up with on my own. I had to do something. At the time, there wasn't mentors you didn't find much. So, and if you did, it wasn't for agriculture. It was home garden. But so on the left, that's my water source. The middle tank's my filter tank that everything goes through, and the big tank's food source and diluted foods. I dilute them so you don't want to put your bacteria and fungi into straight foods. So I'll mix up enough of that. Well, when I'm spraying, 200 gallons goes into my 1,000-gallon tank of the food source, and then the compost extract. So I'll put as much foods as I want in 50 acres, whatever, per 200 gallons.
So where's your actual compost going when you take them?
My what?
Is your compost actually in this system that you're getting the extract out of, or is it?
No, there's no compost involved there.
Okay.
Compost goes in here.
Okay.
You fill this with water, you turn the air on, and it bubbles. This is a variable speed. I have a 2-horse, 220 amp or volt blower. So I've got that's for an industrial ceiling fan, variable speed switch, so I can control my air wherever I want it. Works really good. So I get it. Yeah. Sorry about that. Anyway, I just dumped the compost in buckets on the top. I tried the the bags, and I think I've tried them at least 3 times, and I just can't stand them. So they just, I just dump the compost in top. I start out with 3 buckets, and then I only harvest it to there. So I'll shut the air off, and everything settles to the bottom, and the organic matter goes to the top. And I can pull 350 gallons of extract out of there and run it through my filter. It works good. And then I'll fill it with water. I add 350 gallon back, and I put 2 buckets in, and I just keep it going through the day. I'll usually clean it out the next morning, because I usually spray till dark, or evening's the best. So, and then those pumps, these are just, that's a ag pump. Those are pull pumps. They're electric motors. They got a 2-speed motor on them. So when I'm loading the sprayer, when I'm loading compost extract, I run it on low. I idle that pump and I run them on low. Just try to not be destructive. Anyway, so we're going to jump to seed coating, because it's important to get the biology on the seed. So I just mix up extract for that in buckets. I take a 5-gallon mixer on a drill, and I put a shovel of compost in, 4 gallons of water, and stir it up good, let it sit for a while, stir it up again, and then I get some of them bucket screeners, and you don't have to screen it too fine because you're just putting it on the seed. And so that's, then I make a seed soak, which is, I thought I had, I think we're coming to that. And then I add a little molasses just to help it stick. And I put some mycorrhizal fungi spores in it, and rhizobia for legumes. So yeah, here's the seed soak. And that's just, I take mineral tubs, and I'll put like coffee can of two coffee cans of oats, 1 soy, 1 wheat, 1 alfalfa pellets, and lime. And then you can start using it pretty quick, but you just let it sit, and I just dip it off and run it through a bucket strainer, and that's micronutrients for when you're. I really like it in the starter, because the seeds have all the nutrients they need to grow a plant. They're full of it, and the lime is the calcium. All nutrients adhere to calcium. I'm not saying they all do, but they like calcium. So it's just my own mix. I started that in 17, and I like it. So, and I use non-medicated milk replacer at a rate of about 1/4 pound an acre. So not a lot, but it's just adding some diversity to the foods. What better start of life than milk? Fish hydrolysate. I don't have proportions here. Molasses. So molasses is about half of roughly 1/4 an acre on the fish, and a pint on the molasses. It could be double that, but you don't need a lot because you're only feeding the microorganisms. That's the only purpose of it in the mix. So this is, Elaine always talked about maximum food sources at 4 tablespoons per gallon. And that's more for when you're making a tea, because you don't want to get too much foods in there. But I kind of I use it with my extracts. It's, they do great on it. It's just to get them to multiply when they get out there, have something to eat. So anyway, there's 256, I think, don't quote me, tablespoons in a gallon. So I took it down to 250 because then I can do math in my head. So 4 gallons of foods per 250 gallons of whatever you're spraying. 16-gallon maximum in my sprayer. So of foods, but then I mix that into 200 gallons of water, so it goes in diluted.
So Jim, I guess just going back to that, so with your food source, you're making your food source. You said, so then there's only 4 gallons of that food source per 250 gallons, right?
4 gallons maximum of actual foods, not diluted foods. Because I'll dilute that 4 gallons into, I go by 1,000-gallon sprayer, so I'll put maximum 16 gallons of molasses, fish, whatever, within that 200 gallons. So every time I load, I just load 200 gallons of that. And so I mix up for the day. So if you have to stop and do anything, you don't get anything sprayed. So I just pull up, I dump that in, I put the compost in, I rinse out my filter tank and put in there, and I would fill up my cone tank and start the blower, and I'll dump 2 buckets of compost in, and I go spray. So it runs as long as I'm spraying. That's how long it runs. So I think I probably explained all that. And then I say 18 to 25 gallons. I fill my sprayer. I top it off with water always so that it's full. And then my fields are mostly 50 acres, but some are less and some are a little more. And I just empty my tank in a field. So that's why it varies there. Push back. We running out of time yet?
Nope, you're good.
More tips. Fall application works best for getting biology down deep in the soil because it works all winter, and especially in the pastures if you got some, because if I knew what I knew now when I started, I would have got through all my pastures before I ever started any crop ground, because it's taken 3, 4, 5 years, some fields 5 years that I've been working on the crops, but I didn't want to give up until things got to working. And so now that I got things in really good shape, I'm going to start working on the pastures in the falls. I like, the pastures work good because you already got the diversity of the grass grow, and it's live and it's growing, and it's not like your crop fields. So things work fast. Do it in the fall. Coat all your seeds with extract, or put it in furrow with that's what I do with the corn planters, in furrow, and everything else I've treated. And you can do both. I treat covered crop seed like a cash crop. And that means coat your seed and spray it with extract and get the best covered crop you can. And I use mycorrhizal fungi inoculum because I'm not sure what I got. I don't know specifically if I have it in the compost. There could be spores of it, and maybe the oats are doing it, but I guess I should have it analyzed sometime. But I just add a little every time, not much. I don't add it in the summer, just spring and fall, because it's not going to do you any good. But then I'm not organic, so if I spray something bad, which is only herbicides, contact herbicides, I always come back a week later and spray biology over the top, and it just kind of helps reassure that you're fixing things that you just screwed up. So, and then keep things clean, and they don't have to be super, but keep things rinsed out. I do my when I'm kind of done for the season, I'll do a really good clean because it's going to sit till fall. I do a really good clean, and then before winter, I'll do the good clean. So and sometimes maybe in between, but not more than 3 really good cleans. But otherwise, just keep things rinsed out, just because of time. So there's timing of when I like to spray. Fall, in furrow. This is for corn. I like to spray it at like 5-6 inches high. See, I spray my contact herbicide on corn at spike, and I plant just in whatever's there. I spray at spike. I spray it again at 5 to 6 inches. And then if I have to clean up on corn, I'll spray it late and then come back before I can still get through it, spray it again. Beans, fall, coat seed, first trifoliate, and then at first bloom, not while it's blooming. You can come back after it's set and go again if you want, but I just stop at first bloom. Wheat, fall, 5-leaf, or now I'm going to say if you can get it on before 4-leaf, that would be best. Just from something I learned the other day. At first head, that's the most important. During this drought, I snuck some extra sprays in, and it was great. But if you can keep this up for 3 years, your soils are going to be in really good shape. So that's why I said I'm gonna drop the fall spray, and I'm not gonna drop it on the wheat. I'm gonna drop it on the corn and beans, and so I can work on some pastures for a few years. I'm not saying that's set in stone. And visitors are welcome. That was my wife was at a friend of hers house, and that was in her garden, and she sent me that picture, so I had to put that in there. And that's a 0 and corn.
So do you have any synthetic fertilizer on that? Or
No. That field has,
yeah.
That field at that time it hadn't had any. That was the 3rd year with no synthetics.
And you're not using any really?
Nothing.
None. So everything, all of your fertility is right now from your compost extract?
It's all from the soil.
Right.
The biology does it all.
How about your yield?
10% higher on corn and 30% higher on beans compared to what I was doing.
Yeah.
My inputs are, you can just start subtracting fungicide, pesticide, commercial fertilizer. My fertilizer, the crops get a lot out of the food source that I mix with that, because there's amino acids and fulvic acids and humic acids, omic acids, and those are like the instant. Plants just suck them in. They don't have to screw around with any biology with that stuff. Amino acids, proteins go right into plants without. They don't have to stop and buy a ticket to get in. So,
Jim, do you see any type of insect pressure, or have you tested what pressure levels are?
No, I bought insecticide and fungicide every year, and I in 18 I bought it because I wanted to have it for a safety net. It's still sitting in the shed. We had painted lady butterflies.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean they were thick, and I thought that was kind of when I was getting started there, and I was like, well, I could have sprayed them. So I had to spray them for Roundup anyway. So I put a quart of molasses in with my Roundup, and 3 days later I went out there, I couldn't find one. But I always add a carbon source when I'm spraying chemicals also.
To help them break down.
Yeah. Yeah, molasses or extract.
So I was just reading that,
Yeah.
Nicole Masters' book, she was talking about putting fulvic acid with your herbicide.
Yeah, I know, but I just use either compost extract or some molasses.
Mixed in with your herbicide.
Yeah, that's part of my spray. No matter what I'm spraying, if it's dicamba or Roundup or whatever, I always add.
Another thing, on the bus, you were talking a little bit about you noticed difference in weed pressures according to staff.
The weed pressure, I haven't eliminated it, but pretty close. It's the weed pressure is down. It seems like it's. I get some water hemp along the roads, and cover crop, volunteer cover crop. So I need to work on that. Volunteer cover crop part.
On one of your slides, it says what to use. You have listed rock dust and rock phosphate. What is your supplier of that?
Well,
I don't want anybody that can get the salt rock.
I got the soft rock phosphate from Soil Works in Yankton. The rock dust I've never used. I just threw that in there because it could be I've never used. If I could find some, I'd probably buy some. But anyway, I'm gonna read my closing statement because it won't take too long, I hope. Okay. In closing, I'll say that I'm not an expert, that I'm just I was just a kid from Nebraska that wanted to farm. The way I farm has been a personal venture. I hear a lot of talk about products for sale, and I use some, but for the most part, everything you need is on your own farm or nearby community. I had to put that in because of the wood chips. I hear a lot of people say you have to have certain levels in your soil tests, like calcium, organic matter, pH, just certain levels or certain ratios before you start adding biology. I say don't wait, because the biology is what and the plant together are going to make it right around the roots, and then eventually the whole soil. Let's see. Well, biology and plants are the only thing that can build organic matter, and they will make everything right in the root zone and eventually correct the soil. Another reason I stay aerobic is compaction, which I think is the biggest problem in agriculture today. Big equipment is minor. We're killing off biology with our practices. We've lost our soil structure. We're only farming the top inches of the soil minerals. Compaction layers are anaerobic, which are great conditions for bad pathogens. I see no reason to try to grow and promote anaerobic organisms, which some people do. They will be there anyway. They form their own communities within the aerobic world. Make your soils breathe again. The greatest moment for me was when I could bury my compaction tester to the vice grip in every field I farm. In June, when the roots are going down, I know that air, water, roots, and biology can go down deep. Now I'm farming in feet. And I must say, if water can go down, water can go up. And it's going to trap into organic matter going both ways. You can get in out of the air if you can get air in the soil. The biology will make sure of that. Natural forms of nutrients, proteins, and amino acids are the easiest way to get food in a plant. I often say I wish I could start farming again knowing what I know today. There's another way to farm, and Mr. Wonderful would want in if he could. So do more than regenerate your soil. Make your soil endless. I just hope that something Virginia or I said today makes this a life-changing event for you.
All right, other questions for Jim?
When I started, I couldn't. It was like that. I couldn't get in my soils. Then last June, I buried this everywhere, all the way, easy, just pushed right down. The soil's so loose, so aggregated, and this through a drought. My soils are improving in the drought. My yields were down, way down, but
How about the visual from the road as far as neighbors go? I mean, you get your comments from that.
no comment.
I mean, do you hear excuses? How come your stuff is doing good? Or...
Yeah. Well, anyway, any questions?
You have a lot of solids left after you make your teas. You've got these screens and stuff like that, and you've got a little bit of waste afterwards. Is it enough to start another pile? Or
Oh, everything I do goes back on top of my pile. It just keeps recycling. Yeah. Know that when you shut your air off, and I learned that from Joel Williams, you shut your air off, all your solids go to the bottom, all your organic matter goes to the top. I just pump that through. There's hardly anything. I can leave that screen, that homemade screen I made in that tank all day. Occasionally, late afternoon, I might have to clean it out once, but usually I can go a day because there isn't much. It's, but I want to come up with a little better system. This works great, but I'm worried about losing nematodes because they might go down right away in that 10-15 minute span.
That's how long you settle. Like 10,
yeah, that's kind of what it takes. If you don't if you didn't let it settle long enough, I'm gonna plug my filter right away. It's just a homemade stack screen. There's 3 different screens in it. So it's hard to, when you're not right there looking at it, it's hard to explain everything. And I didn't want to bring everything here. But I brought the most important tool I have.
Yeah, that was the.
Do you still use your microscope?
Yes. Well, I'm going to say the last 2 years are so dry. We just, things are different, I'll just say. But, it's hard to go out and get some dry dirt and, use it. But I went out after a rain event we had last summer and got some soil out of the cornfield and looked at it. And there was all these spores, fungal spores, budding. New buds coming out just from that rain. So they're there. They're just, they're just not real active when it's dry. They might be a little deeper, but you guys are dry, I know here, but you were probably drier than us, but we were dry.
So are you checking your samples then with the microscope too?
I do.
Yeah.
Not constantly, no. I do before I use it. Is all. I check. I'm not gonna check every batch of stuff I do and all that. I'm not gonna do it. I check the compost good before I start, and I'll check a couple batches of extract as I'm making them. Maybe just see how things are, and then I just go to work. I'm not gonna look every time, but it doesn't. I can spray 250 acres by myself, doing all this and screening, and I do most of my work in the morning, prep my foods, prep some green compost, clean out anything I have to, and I try to. I like to spray my first load before lunch, and I can easily get 4 or 5 loads. My record's 6, but then I have to be prepared the night before, like when I'm first starting, where I could start spraying early.
So are your savings in not having to apply the fungicides and the herbicides and stuff, or are you really saving a whole lot of money on not applying the fertilizer itself because you spent some of that money towards the ingredients for making your compost?
I don't have much in this. There's nothing invested in
Yeah,
this.
there's no cost.
My setup cost $4,000 maybe totally, with all the pumps and stuff and all my hay and stuff I got, and grass, road ditches. I use a little manure. I like, but I don't make manured compost because I want to make I want something good that I'm not spraying my crops. I want the best I can find. It's okay to compost some waste in the thing, but mostly you want good stuff. And now I'm using ingredients that I've sprayed, and I got straw that hasn't had any herbicide or anything on it, that I'm using in my compost. So that the microorganisms aren't going to die from that. So it just gets better. And then you always put your old compost in with the next, some of it, and you're constantly making a more diverse. It just gets better and better. The first one I did, I wasn't finding any predators much, and I couldn't hardly find any fungi. I sent a sample to Michigan to a place, biology place. Anyway, I called him one day because I had the question, and he said, "Oh, I've been wanting to talk to you." He said, "That's like the most fungal compost I've ever seen." He says, "I do about 100 of these a year." And I was like, I didn't see much in it. And since I started using wood chips now, that's a must. That compost I made last summer, that's like 3 times more fungi in there than what I previously made. So that's what I've been after.
Have you tried any of the, like a Johnson Sioux or a static compost system at all?
Nope, this is the way I learned when I was a kid, and I just stick with it. Well, I didn't have a loader, but
The loader idea sounds good.
it takes 10 minutes 4 or 5 times, and after you build your pile, it's still, you got to build your pile no matter how you do it. And I just guesstimate, I get out of a 50-foot pile, I get 5 ton, and that's just a guesstimate. It might be more, but gives me something to.
Will you certify as organic then, because of how you?
I'm not organic.
Could you do it then, or would you bother?
Not a bit. I'm 66. No, this, I say, it was just a personal venture, and it's working. I did get paperwork to do it when we first bought the farm. I say I didn't have equipment to work good, and I just had to go to work and figure it out. So
Part in Nicole Masker's book, she was talking about rangeland that's so depleted that even with the adaptive grazing, they're having a hard time bringing it back.
mm-hmm.
And the guy finally figured out if he started spraying biology out there.
Okay. Yeah, and we didn't talk about pastures too much, but
Yeah.
I say my pastures, when we moved there, they were like this carpet. The guy from our soil conservation come out. I had a program for cross fence, and anyway, it took 10 years before I could say it was worth what I did, what I was doing, and then it just exploded. And I didn't think it could get any better. You know, it was good. And he came out one day and he said, boy, I wish we had a before and after picture. He said, to be honest with you, when I come out that first time, I didn't think it could work. And anyway, it did. And I didn't think it could get any better. And you spray extract on in the fall. And then there's a little pasture, just one example. We had a little pasture in front of our house. It was getting really weedy. We built a house, my wife and I, from 14 to, we moved in spring of 17. And I kept putting off spraying because I was busy. And so I started that extract in 18. And that fall, I went out and sprayed it with extract. And that was the first year. I wasn't putting much on because I didn't have my bubbler yet. So I was just mixing it in buckets and stuff, and I sprayed that pasture. And that next spring, the grass got greener than normal, and then I noticed that the weeds weren't coming in. And then late in the summer, that undercarriage of the grass just got really, really thick. It just getting that biology out there. So what I thought was as good as you could get got better.
So, I do a lot of spraying, but like what bothers me about pastures is I've been doing this for different people is putting Tordon on for leafy spurge, right?
Yeah.
So now you're not only killing leafy spurge, you're killing every clover and every other broadleaf that was beneficial, and then you end up with a little overgrazing. You end up with just brome. So your first weed is leafy spurge. The second one, I wouldn't say brome is a weed, but it's not diverse.
Yeah.
And it's very controlling. And then downy brome is another worse than that. And so, how you can get people spraying leafy spurge all the time and not kill half their biology all the time is ridiculous. Not just that lasts more than a year.
I don't know the answer to leafy spurge.
No,
but
so your answer basically is if you get the undergrowth or get the natural grasses to be thicker and healthier, they'll choke out most weeds. And I'm wondering if that would include leafy spurge.
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm just throwing it out there.
I have one pasture that I got some leafy spurge in, and it was there when I moved there, and it's gotten bigger, and I sprayed it a lot, and I
That's crazy, isn't it?
But, oh yeah, so I don't know the answer. In that pasture, I've never used this stuff on, but I'm hoping this coming fall I get kicked into the. Well, I got some boomless nozzles for my sprayer, so I don't have to open the wing. So I haven't put them on yet. I just got them. So I'm gonna put them. So they'll each be on their separate nozzle, and then I still have that bar. So I'll have a 3. Yeah. That way, if I go along a road ditch, I can kick it on and spray, or tree rows or whatever.
For that reason.
So, them booms, that's terrible. Yeah. And there was a pass.
It's just that when you spray, you want the wind to be consistently from the same direction, because when you shoot it out there, you want it to drift the same.
Yeah.
You know, that
But-
sounds bad drift, but I mean, it's controlled.
How it works.
You're not out there 20 mile an hour, but like, you want to spray, I would say, instead of with the wind, cross the wind, so that you have a consistent pattern with the boneless valves.
There's a beetle that will be leaving spurge, but I think it takes a really thick patch in order for it to survive the rest of the night. I can't remember what it is.
Anyway, biology will do a lot. I don't know about leafy spurge.
Frustrating.
Have you noticed any, because you said something about using alfalfa. And when we were up there, Jay had mentioned using alfalfa for the predators,
For the what?
Was it the nematodes that he was trying to increase with the alfalfa?
Oh.
Remember that? Have you seen, like if you change whether you have alfalfa in your pile or not, do you get more?
I always put alfalfa in my pile. Yeah. And I like fresh alfalfa because it's probably the protozoa. That's my guess.
Yeah, because we see
That's-
a lot of PLFAs that don't have
Yeah.
any protozoa in them.
Mm-hmm. Well, just always make your pile diverse, because there's no one thing that's going to fix anything. So let's just keep it diverse.
So what do you think of all these new sort of commercial products that these sort of biologics that people are starting
They could probably sell ice to an Eskimo.
to?
What's really interesting is different people have me spray that stuff on, but you need a 30 mesh. It's interesting that's what you come up with, because even that stuff, it says right on there, extreme agitation.
Oh,
Because if it settles out at all, or even as it goes through like a 50
Yeah, but that's
mesh or a
just-
60 mesh, it'll clog it up every time. And so
Doesn't
we've gotten away from screens in the nozzles themselves and just putting them on
mm-hmm.
for those products. Any of that dirt colored stuff, like what
The
he's,
problem is,
anything that's commercial.
if it costs the same as bringing fertilizer, it's a problem.
Right. It's right. It's overpriced, but I'm saying as far as the active.
So one thing they were telling us, we have a microscope now, at least you can check it. So that we can see if there's anything in there, what they say is in there.
Well, and I've had people drop products off to me to look at, but then never called me to see what I saw. I thought, well, it's your loss. Yeah, it didn't look good to me.